Groovy Hollow 4 is a charity iRacing event benefiting Extra Life and Toys for Tots. Tune in Tuesday, October 29th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/EricEstep, to watch the event live. And you can find out more information by heading to groovyhollowraceway.com. From Coke Series drivers to sim racing professionals, even real-world NASCAR drivers like Brennan Poole, Ryan Vargas, the cast of characters is sure to be unforgettable. Oh, and I'm driving as well. I'll be driving the number 4 Halloween machine. So subscribe to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/EricEstep, and once again, head to groovyhollowraceway.com for more information. Tune in October 29th, 8 p.m. Eastern Time to see Groovy Hollow 4. Hey y'all, EricEstep here. I want to welcome you all to the audiobook edition of The Legend of Groovy Hollow. The annual Groovy Hollow iRacing event is all about supporting Extra Life, a Children's Miracle Network Hospitals program. So to thank you all for your generous support over the years, we bring you The Legend of Groovy Hollow, a novel written by Cody Williams and performed by Jillian Cool. Groovy Hollow Raceway has been found, and for the first time in decades, racers are set to turn laps around the storied short track. Is it really as supernatural as the legends say? And will fans be greeted with an appearance by Bucky Blackwell and his Halloween machine? Let's find out.
Chapter 8. On October 27, 2021, late model short track racing returned to Groovy Hollow Raceway. But it was not the only return of the night. The day for Tommie started as any other. She woke up, showered, did all her morning routines, and went downstairs for breakfast. Mom had made a pot of maple and brown sugar oatmeal with cinnamon raisin toast. It was Tommie's favorite. She joined her mom and dad at the breakfast table. Dad was still in his pajamas as he took a day off from work to prepare for the day. He sipped from a mug of coffee with "Number 1 Dad" written in black letters on the side. Tommie remembered when she had bought the cup at a souvenir shop in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, on the way home from a church trip to Dollywood one summer. Dad drank coffee from it every morning, which made her heart happy. He was reading the paper, but when she entered the kitchen, he raised the mug to toast her. "Sit down, honey. I made your favorite," Mom said. As she prepared for work, she was wearing her uniform, a blue polo shirt and black slacks. She managed a small convenience store in Newport. Tommie did, and she ate in silence for a while until both pieces of her toast were gone, and only a little bit of the oatmeal remained in her bowl. She was still going to school. That was the plan, as she had had perfect attendance since kindergarten and had no intention of giving up that award at the end of year awards banquet at school. "Now remember, honey, I'll be by to get you after lunch, say around 12:30 or so. Qualifying starts at 3, but I'd like to get over the track in time to just look around, at the souvenir tents and whatnot." Tommie did know, and she wholeheartedly agreed, nodding as she took the final bites of her oatmeal and pushed the empty bowl away from her. "Sounds good." She started to get up to kiss her mom and dad on the cheek. Randall, her bus driver, was surely there by now, and she didn't want to keep him waiting. He got a bit ornery when he had to wait. She started to get up when her mom flashed her a look. Tommie sighed, "Fine," and picked up the empty bowl and carried it over to the sink. She placed it gently inside, squeezing a small pea-sized amount of Dawn dish detergent into it and filling it full of warm water to soak. Then she kissed her dad and then her mom, and they said their goodbyes. As she knew he would be, Mr. Randall was sitting on the shoulder of the road waiting. He honked his horn at her. "Coming, I'm coming," she hollered, but doubted that he could hear her over the loud roar of the bus's engine and hissing of the exhaust. She climbed the stairs and fed into the aisle. "Thanks, Mr. Randall," she said. "Oh, well, you're very welcome, but get out here a little sooner next time. I have a schedule to keep," he said. Tommie nodded and rolled her eyes. The bus was already moving down the road before she found her seat near the back of the bus. She sat down next to Samantha, her longtime best friend. "What's that?" Samantha asked, a note of disgust in her voice. She pulled at Tommie's shirt, a T-shirt she had bought several years ago at a souvenir trailer parked outside of Kingsport Speedway. The image on the front and back were the same. A NASCAR Real and Modified number 39 car with a Rocket Man written in bold red-orange type. It was not the most fashionable thing she could have worn, but hey, it was race day, and she was feeling special. "It's a Brian Newcastle shirt," Tommie said. When he retired from NASCAR Cup Series racing, he dipped down into the modifieds. "He was at Bristol mingling with fans last year. I got him to sign it for me. Look." She leaned forward, showing off the barely legible scribble of a signature signed in Sharpie just over her right shoulder. Sam smiled and shook her head. "You and your racing," she said and sort of giggled. It was an endearing sound. "So, are you excited for the race today?" "Sure am. Dad's picking me up early. After lunch, though. You won't be missing me too bad throughout the day." Sam's last class with Tommie for the day was Mr. Bauer's 10:45 a.m. math class. "So you won't miss Mr. Bauer's test then? Good. You know it's an open note, open friend quiz." "Yeah, unfortunately, I'll still be there for that," Tommie said. "You mean fortunately? You can't skip out on me, girl. We're going to tandem this test, you and I." Tandem. Tommie smiled at the word. It was a word Tommie used somewhat on the regular before Sam even knew what it meant. She used it because of the old two-car tandem form of drafting at tracks like Daytona and Talladega that the Cup Series guys used to do back in the mid-2000s. Though at the same time, Tommie hated it and often preferred larger pack-style racing at the plate tracks. Sometimes she missed it, particularly when any given race at Daytona, Talladega, or now Atlanta got to be strung out, boring train racing with all the cars forming a single file line atop the track next to the wall with minimal passing opportunities available. Talk about a snooze fest. At least with the two-car tango, there was always corners and goers, and the ends to races were always dicey. "I'd never skip out on you, Sam. We're going to ace this test, and we're going to do it together." They did their secret handshake. "Bet," Sam said excitedly. They ended the handshake by putting their foreheads together and looking each other dead in the eyes. Chapter 9. Dad, as promised, came to pick her up from school just after noon. It was a Wednesday, which meant that the Commonwealth High School cafeteria was serving a choice of mini corn dogs or fish sticks, with a side of soup beans, mac and cheese, and cornbread. Never a fan of fish in stick form or otherwise, Tommie opted for the corn dog nuggets, hold the soup beans, but helped herself to a second serving of mac and cheese that was better than it had any right to be. She had just polished off her last bite of battered dog dipped in a mixture of ketchup and mustard when Mr. Crandall, the second assistant principal of the school, approached her. "Tommie, your dad is in the office to pick you up." Tommie looked at Sam, who smiled at her. "Go on, go girl, take your tray." "Thanks, Sam," Tommie said happily. "You're welcome, now go and have fun." Tommie nodded. Of course they were going to have fun. There wasn't anything like getting out of school early to go to a race. She gathered up her things, wrestled them into her book bag, zipped them up, and made a beeline for the front office where she met Dad. "Are you ready for your doctor's appointment?" Dad said and winked at her. Tommie shoved at him, mouthing for him to knock it off. He was going to blow it. As they were heading out the door, Miss Barnett, the front desk secretary, called after her. "Have fun out there today, Tommie. I hope it's a good race." Tommie looked back, and the woman was winking at her. She looked up at her dad, who was having difficulty containing his excitement. She always loved the passion of her father, especially when it came to racing. He was just too excited to keep the secret of Tommie's little faux doctor's appointment just between the two of them. She hugged him and climbed up into his truck. Dad did the same on the driver's side and turned the key. The big Ford F-150 roared to life. Tommie looked over at him as he pulled his Chase Elliott 2020 championship hat down tighter over his head as he fumbled with his seatbelt. When it clicked into place and he pulled the belts tight, he looked over at Tommie. "You excited?" he asked. "A little more than," Tommie replied. "Well, then, let's go," he said. He shifted the truck into gear and they were off, headed for the races. After they parked in the gravel pit of a parking lot and got out of the truck, Tommie and her dad could hear the roaring of engines racing around the short oval. The sound wasn't as loud as it could have been, with Tommie noting that it was probably just one car or two turning laps in practice. "What time did practice start?" Tommie asked her dad as he grabbed the backpack cooler and threw it over her shoulders. "I think the first session was around 11. I think there was an hour break between noon and 1. He looked down at his watch. "This is probably the second session." He reached into his back pocket of his jeans and took out a track schedule he had printed up the night before off the revamped Groovy Hollow website. "Oh yeah, here we go," he said, pointing. "This is session 2 of 4. Qualifying will go down at about 5, I reckon. Race starts at 7:30. He folded the paper and shoved it back down into his jeans pocket. Tommie looked around at the track and the land around it. She was astonished by how much it had changed since she was last there. Gone was the overgrowth of nesting weeds. Gone were the condemned buildings and the porta-potties. Gone were the grandstands and the old-school press box harboring all sorts of bees and wasps. The smell of fresh paint coated the air around them. Outside to the right of the men's room was a Pepsi vending machine that was, by its looks, relatively new. Tommie could tell by the way the wall looked on the corner of the track that safer barriers had been added. A new high-rising grandstand structure with a new state-of-the-art press box perched on top ran parallel to the front stretch. There were small, plain white trailers littered around the parking lot from which different drivers' merchandise was being sold. Tommie assumed that the haulers that brought all the cars to the track were likely on the other side, outside turns 1 and 2. "Come on, let's go. I want to see as much of the on-track action today as I possibly can," Dad said, and Tommie concurred. They took each other by hand and started for the entrance of the track. Tommie was hardly aware that her excitement had taken her from a fast walk to a trot and then to a slow run. Dad was following from behind, struggling to keep up. But he wasn't complaining. He wanted to see the insides of the facility just as much, maybe even a little more than she did. When they got to the front gate, a man with a full, woolly red beard and long brown hair was there to check them in. He inspected their coolers and scanned the 2 barcodes of the day's passes on Dad's phone and stepped aside. "Have fun and enjoy," the man said. The name tag over his heart read Cody, and under the name was the official Groovy Hollow Raceway logo. "Thanks," Tommie said as she and Dad slipped by the man, who then turned to help the next person in line. The crowd inside the facility was thin, but Tommie had a feeling that it wouldn't stay that way for long. In fact, she hoped the place would be absolutely packed. She wanted the Groovy Hollow Race to be the biggest success it could be so that they'd get to do it again for many years to come, save for a few of the press box ticks gobbled up by the bigwigs and sponsors of the surrounding area were general admission tickets, meaning that they could sit virtually anywhere they wanted. Dad scrolled through his phone. "Where do you want to sit?" he asked. For Tommie, the answer was obvious. "Start-finish line, where else? Maybe about halfway up the stands. I don't want to be so low that I can't see the other side of the track." Dad nodded. "Okay, that's where we'll head then." He paused a moment to look around. "Do you want to maybe shop around some or get some concessions?" Tommie shook her head. "No, I just want to go in and look at the track." She put her hand over her stomach. "Besides, I'm still full from lunch at school. We can come back out later, maybe after qualifying." Dad agreed, and the 2 went into the grandstands to find their seats. Chapter 10. The seats in the grandstands were aluminum bleachers that were hard on both Tommie's and Dad's butts. The 2 of them taking turns periodically through the practice sessions to stand up and walk around, searching for any form of relief. They watched practice off and on while also glimpsing into a program Dad had picked up at the information booth located near the front gate. The program had all the drivers' numbers and names of those who were attempting to qualify for the event. There was a grand total of 80 late-model drivers and teams showed up to make the 40-car main event. "Roughly half of these drivers are going to be very disappointed," Dad said, and Tommie agreed. But it was easy to predict a couple of the drivers who were definitely going to be in the show. For starters, there was Brandon Power, who was driving the number 6 late-model Chevy Camaro. Tommie spotted that car instantly, and she recognized the likeness of Eric Estep on the hood and his brand Out of the Groove stamped on the quarter panels. "That Brandon Power guy, he's a NASCAR guy, ain't he?" "Yeah," Tommie confirmed. "Xfinity Series. He drives a car that looks almost exactly like that." She pointed at the number 6 Camaro as it turned laps around the track. "The sponsor on that car, Out of the Groove, that's my favorite YouTube racing content creator. Eric, the host, does pretty much daily videos about NASCAR, race recaps, daily news, that sort of thing." Tommie squinted and looked for the classic black and yellow colors down in the pits. Eric was there, and it wasn't hard to spot him. There, he's standing right there, Dad. Dad followed Tommie's finger and zoned in on the pits. Who, that really tall guy? Man, how tall is he, do you think? Tommie shrugged. I don't know, but that's him all right. It must be so exciting to sponsor a real-life race car. As the practice sessions came to a close, Tommie noted that there was another car that had an excellent shot at making the main event. It, like Power's OOTG car, wasn't easy to miss with its bright neon green and yellow wrap. The number on the car was 25, and sponsoring the car was Toxic Waste Hazardously Sour Candy. In the corner, just in front of the rear Hoosier tire, was the logo Dogleg Media. Tommie wasn't familiar with that creator yet, but she noticed how frequently the number 25 was near the top of the scoring pylon after each practice session. She flipped through the program, listing all the drivers in numerical order. The driver of the number 25 Toxic Waste Chevy was David Smith, a short-track legend in his own right. With the sheer speed of that hot rod, unless something terrible happened in his time trials, the number 25 machine was going to make this race handily. He did. David Smith solidly put his number 25 Toxic Waste Camaro in the show by scoring the pole position. Brandon Power, also seemingly a threat for the main event win, qualified for the race as well, lining up fourth. Other hotshots in the field were Carson Levin, Dexter Malone out of Whisperwood, Terry Lane out of Knoxville, John Rex out of Kingsport, and Benson Bell, who would make his unprecedented return to racing, driving the number 75 NASCAR-sponsored Toyota. Bringing up the rear was a driver Tommie had never heard of before, but Dad knew him. Jerry Slater. His car was unsponsored and black. That number 00 slapped on the side in a deep neon orange. Slater would be the last to make the field, starting in the 40th position. Hey, I know that guy, Dad said, pointing at Slater in the program. Tommie reached over and took the program from Dad. She looked at the man her father had pointed out as Jerry Slater. And there was something about that man she just didn't like. An eeriness to the photograph. It was like looking at Jeffrey Dahmer's mugshot. He looked angry, but also lost, tired, and left out to dry. The absence of hope on his face and in his sunken eyes was immeasurable. He appeared wayward. Really? How do you know him? I bought Amelia off him. Jerry used to race frequently around the area, but I don't know. He just decided he wanted out one day. He listed Amelia on the marketplace, and I saw it when I was scrolling through Facebook. I thought to myself, Tommie's turning 16 soon. Why not buy it and fix it up? Maybe we could even go racing with it someday. And now Groovy Hollow Raceway is open again. Dad nudged her and offered her a wink. Who knows, maybe you can even make your racing debut here with these hollowed walls. Dad let out a chuckle, thinking he had made a really funny joke. In truth, it sounded like something the Crypt Keeper might have said in that old 1900s HBO show, Tales from the Crypt, and Tommie appreciated it. Then Dad's smile faded. Looks like Jerry got himself another car. Good for him. I'm glad he made the main event, Dad said, but there was a noted cautious tone in his voice. As the go-homers took their cars out through the gate on the backstretch to load them up disappointedly, Tommie and Dad went down to the concessions beneath the grandstands. Dad got a hot dog loaded with chili, mustard, and diced onion, along with Mountain Dew to drink, while Tommie opted for the small personal Hunt Brothers pizza option and bottled water. They got a loaded chili cheese fry to split between them. The food was amazing, as food typically is at sporting events, though the jury was still out in Tommie's mind if that was because the mediocre concession stand hot dogs were just part of the larger ambiance, or if there really was quality there. Whatever the case, Dad said that his hot dog was pretty dang good. But nothing can beat those hot dogs they have at Martinsville, he added and gave Tommie a wink. Maybe we can make the trip up there sometime. Tommie nodded and devoured her pizza, leaving nothing but the crust, the pizza's bones behind. The bread was too filling for her. After they finished eating, they stayed hunkered down beneath the grandstands until it was almost sunset. Tommie wanted to avoid as much exposure to the sun as she could. She remembered to put sunscreen on that morning, but she supposed that she hadn't put on enough. Her skin had turned from a pale white to a bright pink, and it sizzled. They reemerged to their seats around the time the announcer in the press box was starting driver intros. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first, hopefully, annual Groovy Hollow 300 at the historic Groovy Hollow Raceway. Tommie noticed the man's voice but wasn't quite able to put a finger on it. Not yet. Not until the announcer stated their names. This is Jeremy Sandberg, a.k.a. the Iceman, and I'm joined here in the booth with none other than co-host of the Racing History podcast, Davis Gilligan. Are you all ready for some Wednesday night racing? The crowd, including Tommie and her dad, erupted into cheers. Well, let's get this party started by introducing the daring young men and women who will be trying to take on this historic lost speedway. There were more blasts of cheers, and this group was louder than the last. At first, Tommie thought they might have been able to mask the roar of the cars. Yes, well, we sure are excited to bring you the first edition of what will hopefully become an annual spectacle, the Groovy Hollow 300. Jeremy's booming voice echoed off the mountain but was quickly covered up by the roar of the endearing fans in attendance. That's right, Jeremy, Davis chimed in. We are thrilled to be here with you tonight, and we cannot wait to go short track racing under the lights here at Groovy Hollow. Let's meet our starting lineup for tonight. And one thing to remember, none of these drivers are bus. They were the 40 best cars to attempt to qualify for this event, and they have traveled far and wide to put on a great Wednesday night show for you, the fans. With that in mind, let's give all these brave men and women a big round of applause. The roar of the crowd again eclipsed all other sounds in the stadium, and it lasted for a couple of minutes before slowly tapering off. Now let's meet our driver. Jeremy retook the center stage. Starting in the 40th position, driving the number 00 Chevy for Smokin' Slater Enterprises, Commonwealth's own welcome back to racing Jerry Slater. The reaction for Slater was lukewarm. He received a few good-natured applauses and cheers, but there was an underlying murmuring from shocked fans who just couldn't believe he was back. Dad clapped, but hesitantly with a weary look on his face. Slater walked across the stage at the start-finish line, took a moment to wave toward the crowd, and then proceeded to his car. Tommie noticed that he was walking funny, as there was a noticeable limp, and he had an accented sense of care for his strut. He looked off, too. His skin was a waxy pale, almost with a tint of blue. Bruised purple bags hung low under his eyes, which were utterly blank, as if there were no consciousness at all in them. He reached his car and took a moment, leaning up against the right front fender, using it as a crutch. He looked winded, out of breath, and from such a short distance. One thing was for certain. Jerry Slater did not look well. Tommie looked up at her dad to see if he had noticed his appearance as well and was just as baffled. The dark look of concern on his features indicated that he had. I don't like this, Dad said, but not to Tommie nor to anyone in particular. He spoke the words simply as a thought voiced out loud, left out in the cold, unprotected and for anyone to interpret. They ran down the list of drivers, from field fillers to the potential race winners out front. Some drivers, particularly the NASCAR spoilers, got more applause than others, but the names and even the sound of the roaring crowd faded into the background. Tommie's focus kept flipping back to Jerry Slater, who looked worse and worse with each passing second. Before long, it was time for the Daredevils to strap in and start their engines, and Tommie watched as Slater struggled to walk around the front bumper of his car. He seemed to waver there in the air woozily. He leaned to the right, catching himself on the front left fender before his right knee gave out from under him, and he went down. His head thudded against the concrete, and though she knew she probably hadn't, Tommie thought she could hear the crack of his skull as it bounced off the hard surface. The crowd in awe stood up, pointing and voicing their concerns. But all that noise was little more than a simmer above the chaos, seasoning the scene. The officials, all wearing Groovy Hollow crew shirts, with a small out-of-the-groove patch on the left breast, rushed to the scene, tending to Jerry Slater. They checked his pulse, and it was seemingly good, though maybe a little weak. And before they knew it, an ambulance was backing up next to a crowded cluster of suits and officials around Jerry. Driver stood, watching with concern from a safe distance. Jeremy and Davis wrestled with shock in their uncomfortable silence in the booth. It took a moment to load Slater up onto the stretcher and get him completely situated. Tommie's initial instinct was to look away, to shield her eyes as if what she was witnessing unfold in real time was taboo. Yet all the same, she couldn't look away. Her face started to burn, and she got the sudden urge to cry, but she choked it down. She looked side-eyed at Dad. The tears in his eyes were prominent and shimmering. His eyelids threatened to burst with the weight of the overwhelming emotion. Slater moved a couple of times on the stretcher, which in Tommie's mind was promising. But she had been a race fan long enough that the absolute worst thing to do is to understate the severity of any given situation. She learned that much watching the horrific crash in the 2020 Daytona 500 the year before. That was the closest thing to a casualty in one of the NASCAR's top 3 touring series since the last scary crash at Richmond in 2003. And who could forget the incident that would claim the life of all-time NASCAR great Dale Earnhardt? But this issue, whatever the true nature of the situation was an off-track problem, and Tommie said a silent prayer, pleading for everything regarding Slater's position to be all right. Once Slater was loaded up in the ambulance, and it started to pull out from the back end of pit road, the gate in the outside retaining wall swung open. Crewmen for the 00 Chevy took out a solid black car cover and started to cover the car. Tommie watched as the orange 00 disappeared before her very eyes, masked beneath the black veil of the cover. She was so out of it at that point that she hardly even heard the firing and revving of an engine somewhere outside the track. Somebody heard something, though, as she heard a man ask from behind her, "Anybody else hear that?" But his voice was a ghost with little substance attached to it. It was window dressing, and it snuck by Tommie just like a good, benevolent phantom should. The malevolent ones, though, wanted to be heard and seen. They demanded nothing short of everyone's undivided attention. Those were the ghosts who had something to say, something to communicate with the living, an unfinished business of some kind. The ambulance, which flashed its lights but otherwise muted its sirens, rolled out from the back stretch and into the gravel pit surrounding the facility. The officials manning the gate started to shut it when the sound of an engine revving again cracked through the barrier of sound created by the gawking public. As the ambulance disappeared around the corner, another vehicle of an entirely different make and purpose drove onto the backstretch. Tommie couldn't believe it, and neither could her dad, or anyone else who was bearing witness as the infamous Halloween machine slithered into the frame. The car was just as Dad described it, an older version of the late-model stock car, splattered in bright black, orange, and white colors with its name proudly advertised on the hood. The Halloween machine. The number on the door was 31, and Tommie assumed that it was meant to represent the 31st day of the month, All Hallows' Eve itself. The car came to a stop and waited, the rumbling of its engine the only sound in the whole stadium. Otherwise, Tommie thought it was so quiet that one might be able to hear a pin drop. Then the car started to roll once more, entering the third turn at a crawling pace. The crew members of the 00 team looked relatively unfazed by this. Tommie watched them as they gathered their sparse tools and supplies and sat them on the deck lid of the 00 late model as they started to roll it backward out of the entrance of pit road. She watched how they moved like well-oiled machinery, blank, indifferent looks on their otherwise ghastly faces. "They look bored," Tommie said aloud, but nobody paid her any mind, not even Dad. Bored wasn't the right word anyhow, not really. It was too soft of a word. In all honesty. In reality, the crewmen didn't look bored at all, they looked dead. Tommie speaking aloud sparked something in the crowd. She doubted whether or not anyone had heard her, let alone processed what she had actually said, which was distinguishable from what she was really thinking. But it broke a seal of some sort, giving the rest of the members of the dumbfounded crowd whatever permission it was they thought they needed to speak themselves. One man behind them cursed, another prayed to God. One woman whimpered in the background, almost like she was afraid to make too much racket, thinking that the man behind the wheel of the infamous number 31 Halloween machine might hear her if she sobbed too loudly. Some members of the crowd fainted. There was a lot of commotion in those tiny clusters of chaos dispersed through the maddening crowd as loved ones, or maybe just fellow do-gooding spectators, shouted for help quickly. Tommie looked up at her dad, who had this strange expression on his face. It was a worrisome look, yet not one of surprise. He expected this sort of thing to happen. He looked down at her and tried to force a smile. "Buckle up, Tommie," he said to her. "I think we're going to see something here like most people have never seen before. I think we're in for a real spectacle." Tommie paid extra attention to how her father's voice cracked and wavered when he spoke the word spectacle. Then he looked away back down at the track. Tommie did the same, and they watched as the creepy number 31 Halloween machine met up with the car and the crewmen of the 00 car. The brakes of the Halloween machine squalled as he rolled to a stop. The zombie men tending to the 00 car stopped pushing, turning their full attention to the driver of the number 31. The driver of the Halloween machine stuck an arm out the window and did some sort of three-fingered gesture Tommie didn't understand. Then his arm slithered back inside through the window. The driver shifted the car back into first gear and drove forward, his tires spinning a little on the blacktop as he pulled out from where he had stopped. On their side of the track now, Tommie looked to see if she could see anyone inside the fabled Halloween machine. She squinted and strained her eyes as much as she could in a futile and dizzying attempt to see something. Anything, but there was nothing there. The windshields, both front and back, were completely blacked out. On the passenger side window opening, she couldn't see what was inside the car. Not even under the bright burn of the bleached white stadium lights. It was entirely black on the inside to the point where nothing was decipherable. Not a helmet, not a sponsor logo, not gloves, not even a fire suit. Tommie looked over and saw the zombie men pushing the withdrawn 00 out of the third turn and onto the backstretch, heading for the gate inside the wall. Jeremy cleared his throat in the booth. "We are, sorry about this undeniably bizarre interruption to tonight's festivities." By the shakiness in his voice, Tommie could tell that he too was rattled. There was a shuffling in the background, a sort of muted arguing that Tommie couldn't quite make out. "Nevertheless, I think it's time we get this show on the road. What say you, Davis?" Yeah, enough with the weirdness. Let's get on with driver intros." "Right," Jeremy said, sounding a little more like the voice Tommie had heard on the YouTube channel, but still noticeably rattled. "Due to a medical emergency, I regret to inform all of you that Jerry Slater and his 00 Chevy have withdrawn from his 40th place starting position. We want to wish Jerry a full recovery, and our thoughts and prayers are with him. Let's take a moment of silence, please, in honor of our brother." The crowd went silent, removing their hats and bowing their heads. Tommie did the same but didn't shut her eyes. They remained fixated on the number 31 Chevy at the end of Pit Road, watching it intently. The silence of the crowd seemed to stretch outward to immeasurable lengths. Down on Pit Road, the various crew members and racing officials stood somberly except for at the end, where the Halloween machine sat idling. It had no crew members, no teammates or staff to be seen anywhere. The Halloween machine seemed to be a solo act for the first annual Groovy Hollow 300, and that realization put Tommie at ease slightly. Surely the driver, whoever it was, could not last the entire length of the race without a single pit stop for tires or fuel. But part of Tommie suspected that the situation with the fabled number 31 Chevy went far beyond what was typical, even in late model racing. It seemed to be an anomaly, unique and disturbed. Jerry came back over through the PA system. "With that, let's begin our starting ceremonies by first participating in driver introductions." The crowd applauded cautiously, many of them keeping a keen eye on the idling number 31 sitting menacingly at the entrance of Pit Road. There was a pause then, a hitch in the cadence. Tommie could hear more murmurs from the muffled voices in the background, followed by Jerry quietly uttering, Okay. He cleared his throat, seemingly regaining his composure. "As track executives have just informed me, there has been a change in the script. Since Jerry Slater is unable to compete here tonight, his 00 team has withdrawn. That said, the 41st place qualifier, as well as most other subsequent ones, have already left the premises. Therefore, taking over his spot in the field, driving the number 31 Halloween machine Chevrolet is the man, the myth, the legend." He really leaned into the word "the legend" in a way Tommie detested. "It wouldn't be a race at Groovy Hollow without him, I suppose. Welcome back, Bucky Blackwell." There were cheers and applause for the mythical driver in the crowd, but they were few and far between. Even the ones that were there possessed a marked lack of enthusiasm and were more hesitant offerings of good sportsmanship than anything else. It was clear, through the driver introductions, that the wind had fallen out of the sails of the crowd. The first annual Groovy Hollow 300 at the revamped Groovy Hollow Raceway seemed to be doomed from the jump. And it was all because of the Halloween machine and Bucky Blackwell. Jittery nerves were felt communally throughout the crowd, and Tommie felt them too, along with a sense of drowning disappointment. It was like the memory of watching a childhood home burn to ash beyond recovery. Some of the drivers, such as David Smith and the 25 car and the NASCAR regulars, got cheers, but even they felt lackluster when compared to the expectations, particularly Power, who was by far the most popular and high-profile driver on the entry list. And it all had to do with that number 31 car, sitting there idling on the end of pit road, watching menacingly from the rear of the field, where Tommie had a feeling he wouldn't be for long, waiting to get the show on the road. When the time came for the engines to be fired and the car started to roll out on the track, there was a slight release of tension, though the nervousness remained and could eventually sour over into sheer dread. When the green flag waved, the roar of the engines grew into a collective mountain of sound. Tommie immediately put her earplugs back in and watched as David Smith led the field to the green flag and down into the first turn. As the field passed by the grandstands, Tommie's eyes darted to the rear of the pack, where the number 31 Halloween machine of Bucky Blackwell galloped up the speed. It didn't take long for him to start picking them off either. However, every time Mr. Blackwell got to the rear bumper of the car in front of him, there was this moment where Tommie, and everyone else in the crowd, she imagined, held her breath, waiting for the seal to burst. But it never did. Though Blackwell did offer a few love-tap shots from behind the car in front of him, and though the driver he was tailgating most likely wasn't happy with him, it was nothing egregious. Tommie had seen worse driving in today's NASCAR Cup Series, and they were the all-time greats, the true all-pro team. These were local short-track racers, and while the tension wound around her throat like a chain, it never pulled tight enough to choke off her airstream. The most aggression Bucky got in those opening laps was to give the driver in front of him a shot from the back in the corner, which then sent the out-of-shape driver up the track. But they were always able to hold on to it. It was just the classic bump and run. Astonishingly, they were able to make it all the way to lap 58 before the first caution for incident would occur. And it really had nothing to do with Bucky at all, at least not directly. By that point, Bucky Blackwell and his infamous number 31 Halloween machine had managed to make it up to third place. He was charging hard, putting pressure on the two cars out in front as they were maneuvering their way through slower lapped traffic. The Halloween machine had several donut tire markings on the door and quarter panels on each side of the car. He wore those race run tattoos like proud battle scars. But the nose of the Chevy Camaro was relatively clean and undented, smeared only with the grimy sludge of hot rubber and dead bugs. Power was leading the race by this point. Power, a veteran on the short-track scene of the southern United States, had managed his tires well as others faltered, creating a lot of comers and goers until a new leader assumed the point. David Smith was lagging behind with a rearview mirror full of Blackwell and the appropriately painted Halloween machine. Tommie didn't know for sure, but she thought maybe the new driver's crew chief came over the radio and warned the driver of the number 88 Speedco Chevrolet for Boychick Motorsports that Blackwell was gaining and quick. Maybe that was why Power pushed the envelope a little too far. In his haste to get through lap traffic, Power got into the driver of the number 03. Tommie looked it up. The driver's name was John Lunsford, Mustang, which ultimately sent him around in the middle of the third and fourth turns. Lunsford backed his family-owned car into the outside retaining wall, and Tommie couldn't help but thank the track's lucky stars that the new owners had good enough sense to build a wall there where there was only a sand pit before. The overall pace of the race came to a screeching halt. The drivers slowed and started to catch their breath, while also likely plotting with their crew chiefs down in the pits on what the strategy ought to be going forward. Tommie knew the main concern down on pit road was most likely tires. If teams could stretch fuel to gain even a small amount on their competition, they would. But if the tires are falling off at a big rate, as she suspected they were, that would be their primary concern. In years past, Hoosier tires had typically been made of harder compound than the Goodyears. That was the case back in the 1980s and the 1990s, with the tire wars and what ultimately led to Hoosier exiting NASCAR altogether, save for the lower ranks such as ARCA and the Modifieds. The tires were harder, so even though they did wear throughout a race, they wouldn't show the wear. This led to spontaneous blowouts, causing several driver injuries and in some cases, fatalities. Goodyear had been experiencing similar issues lately, but with their exclusivity contract with NASCAR, they weren't going anywhere anytime soon. Hoosier, on the other hand, was more appropriate for shorter races and shorter runs, hence why they're the perfect tire to use in ARCA and even here at Groovy Hollow. Brandon Power led the field down pit road, save for Bucky Blackwell, who astonishingly stayed out, assuming the lead. A fit of confusion struck the crowd, with several of the smugger spectators saying things like, "He'll be a sitting duck," with an accompanying condescending scoff. Tommie, however, wasn't so convinced. She held her breath as if a bad feeling was setting in, kicking off its shoes and making itself at home. When the field lined back up, swerving to their lanes to either side of the choice cone, they prepared to retake the green. Bucky chose the outside lane, leaving Power in the 88 on the inside. That should have been the preferred lane. However, once the green flag waved again, the pack rushed into the first and second corners. The leader had a slight advantage in one, but it would be Bucky Blackwell who would be standing tall, retaking the lead on the outside, heading into the third turn. From there, he never looked back. The 31 rocketed out to a large, gaping lead and was soon smothered in lap traffic. It didn't really slow him down, though. He maneuvered expertly through the back half of the field and was on the verge of even lapping the leaders by the time the checkered flag flew. He never pitted. He didn't have to. His car handled phenomenally, and his tires never wore, not even in the slightest. As the fabled Halloween machine took the checkered flag and the field started down pit road, the celebration began. Bucky started by making donuts around the finish line on the front stretch. Then, amidst all the smoke from the rubber tires, which finally burned, Tommie couldn't quite explain what happened. In an otherwise clear sky, a bolt of lightning seemed to flash out of nowhere. It inexplicably struck the roof of the Halloween machine, and the whole track was washed over with a brilliant white flash of light. Tommie shielded her eyes. Dad pulled her closer. Someone in the crowd screamed, "It's happening again! Hang on!" Tommie did hang on. She reached out and squeezed her dad, pulling him ever closer to her. The stadium lights around the track added to the brightness before shattering, sparks and shards of glass raining down over the track and in the grandstands. More screams. Tommie felt her forearms scraped and battered by the silvery nails of glass, but that was the extent of her injuries. When the light died and the whole track was shrouded in seemingly everlasting darkness, Tommie removed her arm from her face and got a good look down at the track. In the immense darkness of night, there was nobody resting on the finish line. Bucky Blackwell, a man of myth and legend, had once again vanished in plain sight. This time, though, left behind the famed Groovy Hollow Raceway as a grim reminder of his dominant legacy and shady, ghastly urban legend. The raceway would remain over the course of the next year into 2022. A grim promise that Bucky Blackwell would someday return to continue his undisputed reign of terror over the track.
Hey guys, Eric here, and I want to talk to you real quick about the dailydownforce.com. Every day, this website covers the latest news and trends in NASCAR, from silly season right through the checkered flag in Phoenix. Need a new morning routine as soon as you wake up? Well, now you have it, dailydownforce.com. This is the website I use to keep up with the industry, the drivers, and of course, what the community is talking about. And speaking of community, dailydownforce.com is also home to some of your other favorite NASCAR content creators. Plus, they've got all sorts of information that I like to keep bookmarked, like schedules, penalties, ratings, and everything you want to know. Oh, and be sure to check out the merch shop while you're there to find some exclusive diecasts and collectibles. So check out dailydownforce.com, that's dailydownforce.com, and I'll see you in the replies. Thanks for listening, Groovy Gang. We'll be back with more Legend of Groovy Hollow in a moment. All right, gang, we're back. Let's return now to the legend of Groovy Hollow.
Chapter 11. In the weeks that followed the first annual Groovy Hollow 300, not much was said about Bucky Blackwell, his whereabouts, or speculation of what happened that night. The only theories being spoken of were spouted out by the drunks at Goblin's Pub over in Johnson City, but they didn't amount to much. The truth was that when it came down to it, anyone who was stone cold sober didn't want to mentally touch the topic, even with a 10-foot iron rod. Tommie didn't forget Bucky Blackwell, nor his slickly painted Halloween machine. She didn't forget about Jerry Slater either, especially whenever she was sitting in what was now her number 28 late model Camaro that previously belonged to the former racer. She did follow up on Slater. He had been transported over to the Dwayne Franklin Memorial Hospital in Kingsport and was located first in their ICU unit. When she finally got her full driver's license, Tommie took a drive over there a time or two just to see what was on the up and up and or whether or not his condition had changed. And every time she was bitterly disappointed. Following his embarrassing collapse the night of the Groovy Hollow 300, Jerry Slater had slipped into a coma. Brain activity was there, per the doctors, so he wasn't brain dead, but his breaths were shallow and haggard. Tommie didn't know if he could make it out of the woods or not, but she prayed for him every day, from fellow racer to fellow racer. The last time she saw him before the second annual Groovy Hollow 300 was scheduled to commence, he looked bad. His skin was pale gray and the veins in his face were accented, making it look almost black. He had lost a bunch of weight, and Tommie thought he looked like he was hanging on by a mere thread. Doctors didn't know what to make of his case. None of the tests they threw his way matched up. The coma seemed almost otherworldly and mystical. Not that the doctors believed in that sort of thing. Tommie did. She had seen it with her very own eyes with Bucky Blackwell. During her many visits, as she looked at Jerry, she wondered if his remaining there was somehow connected to Bucky's return and subsequent disappearance. When school let out for summer break, Tommie threw herself into working on her race car. She started bright and early every morning around dawn and didn't end until dusk on most nights, her dad by her side cheerfully whistling along with every classic rock song that happened to be blasted over the radio. Sometimes, particularly on those later nights when she felt like engaging in an old-fashioned campfire ghost story, she thought about asking her dad about Bucky and what he thought had happened to him. But the look on his face, that trembling, fish-belly white expression of fear, that night as they left the track always stopped. Sometimes it was better to let sleeping dogs lie until they woke up for good and started causing a ruckus. Tommie turned her first laps in her number 28 machine that summer, testing over at the Kingsport Speedway. But that was the extent of it, and could only turn a few laps when her dad could afford to rent out the track for an afternoon. Dad tried to get in contact with Eddie and Richards over at Groovy Hollow, but to no avail. The line was always busy or just straight up dead. Going through the woods to see the track, as they were apt to do at times of immense boredom, it looked once again forgotten and abandoned, like the most lonely of ghost towns. Police watched the place frequently, ready to prosecute trespassers whenever they saw them. It would appear that, at least for the time being, that the Groovy Hollow Raceway was under strict lock and key orders. As the summer wore on, if you asked Tommie or her dad whether or not the Groovy Hollow 300 would return the following fall, they most likely would have answered with an unequivocal no. The proof was in the pudding, so to say, and by all available evidence, Groovy Hollow, still standing, looked like a dead site. Some YouTubers addressed the strangeness around the speedway, but most were silent. Slapshoes was really the only one with a big enough profile to make a whole video about it. The video was titled, "What's the Deal with Groovy Hollow?" and featured him and his crew going near the track and using drone technology to get a glimpse of the inside. To Tommie, it felt dirty and deceitful, like looking into the blank stare of a cold corpse, but she couldn't look away. Towards the end of the abbreviated video, the drone was shot down. The sound of gunshots could be heard off camera, and the view itself went snowy before collapsing into black. At the end of the video, Slap wrote some white text over the blackened screen, providing some explanation as to what had happened. But it was vague and answered a few questions. The subject was eventually dropped altogether. Slap went radio silent on the matter, refusing to answer fan questions about the speedway. A couple of weeks after posting, the video was demonetized on YouTube and subsequently pulled down thereafter. Tommie followed Jeremy and Davis on social media. They, too, were silent on the matter of Groovy Hollow, and if any questions were asked, be it through a direct message or point blank on the platform, they were ignored and deleted, blocked. The future of Groovy Hollow Raceway looked as bleak as ever. It was buried for all intents and purposes. That was until Eric Estep, the Groovy out of YouTube's Out of the Groove, came out with a new cryptic video. The video in question was posted to the video sharing site on October 19th, 2022, and it began with a very gray aesthetic. Dead trees and browning grass were shown, followed by a far shot of Eric with a shovel digging something up in an undisclosed wooded location. The video then cuts to him holding an old VHS tape. Written in faded pencil, the label read, Groovy Hollow, October 1987. Eric then turned back to face the camera, a strange grin appearing on his face before the video ominously faded to black. "Dad! Dad, come here!" Tommie shrieked. Her heart erupted into a dead sprint, and her fingertips shook. She could hear her dad thumping through the house frantically. He sounded like a stampede of elephants. He jerked the door open. Mom wasn't far behind him. "Tommie, what is it? What's the matter?" he asked. Tommie pointed to the computer screen. "Look." Both Mom and Dad rushed over to take a gander. Mom exhaled and said, "Oh, you two and your racing." She turned to walk out. "Didn't mean to frighten you, Mom," Tommie said. Mom exhaled, seeming deflating. "It's fine, dear. I'm all right." She left them alone, her nerves clearly shot as she shut the door behind her. Tommie replayed the video for her dad. "What does this mean?" he asked. "A publicity stunt?" Tommie shrugged her shoulders. "Maybe," she admitted. "But if it is, it's an awful effective one." She turned to look at her dad. "Do you think it's something to do with Groovy Hollow Raceway? Maybe another race there?" Tommie could tell by the way that her dad looked that he doubted it. He had seen the slap video as well. He had saw the drone footage. Groovy Hollow seemed to have rotted away, coming a fossil above anything else. "Possibly. I bet there'll be some sort of announcement this week." The announcement came via social media the following Thursday. There was hype that morning, and Tommie was paying close attention to her Twitter notifications on her phone throughout the school day. The main teaser was a blurred-out banner of sorts with familiar Out of the Groove and Groovy Hollow colors. The official announcement was dropped via Eric Estep's Twitter account at noon, right on the dot. Tommie was in the cafeteria eating lunch. The menu that day was a spicy chicken sandwich or bacon cheeseburger. Tommie opted for the former. When her phone buzzed, she immediately grabbed it, juggling it around in her hands, almost dropping it. She pressed the side button, but the phone gave a delayed response. Eventually, though, the screen did light up and she swiped upwards, keying in her passcode before swiping down once in and tapping frantically on the small blue Twitter bird icon. The app seemed to take forever to load, but once it did, Tommie couldn't contain her excitement. She squealed, getting a few disapproving looks from the lunch ladies and several of her peers. Sarah reached over and grabbed her. "Calm down, honey. Deep breaths." Tommie listened to her friend and slowed her breathing, which made her feel lightheaded after the initial rush of excitement. "You're right. Sorry," she said, feeling a little woozy now. What inevitably brought her back down to earth was her phone buzzing with a text from her dad. The text read, "Groovy Hollow 2 is apparently a go. Tix? ? Tommie quickly texted back, "Yeah, please," and went back into the Twitter app. She turned her phone to show Sarah babbling incoherently, but she got the gist. The second Groovy Hollow racing event was scheduled for Friday, October 28th, 2022. There was to be a coinciding stream with apparent found footage that perhaps explained a little bit about how Bucky Blackwell came to prominence. That was to air the Wednesday before, the 26th of October, live on Eric Estep's Out of the Groove channel in place of the NASCAR Weekly podcast. "All right, I get it," Sarah said with a good-natured laugh, pushing the phone away. "But you need to cool it. Miss Burgess is giving you the stink eye." Tommie looked over to the cafeteria manager, who looked down at her and shook her head. "Sorry," Tommie said softly enough to make Miss Burgess unable to hear. She wasn't sorry, though, not in the slightest. From there, the rest of the school day seemed to drag by. The classes seemed longer and more boring than ever. The teachers seemed especially monotone. In Tommie's mind, all she could think about was the droning sound of engines flying around Groovy Hollow Raceway once again. And she couldn't wait. It'd only be a matter of time. Chapter 12. There was no party of race fan do-gooders to clean up the track this go-around. In the weeks leading up to the second annual Groovy Hollow Race event, to the bitter grumbles of angry Karens living in Commonwealth, various professionals in the area of construction and business consumed the small town, trying to get everything in the best shape they could leading up to the long-awaited sequel to the previous year's race. Various promotional signs could be seen around the community and on the billboards along the two-lane highway feeding in and out of Commonwealth. There were more Facebook and Twitter ads as well as trailers on YouTube ramping up excitement for the event. Last year, the Groovy Hollow 300 felt very grassroots and small. But in 2022, it felt more like a real production. Legit. As promised, as serving as somewhat of a preamble to the main event on Friday night, Eric Estep streamed an alleged origin story of Bucky Blackwell and his Halloween machine, which apparently was once under the control of the Junkyard Jacks, a supposed extinct gang of racing rebels from the heyday of the Groovy Hollow Raceway. Unlike Bucky Blackwell and his Halloween machine, as well as the Groovy Hollow track proper, the whereabouts of the Junkyard Jacks were a mystery, even to the urban legend junkies, the writers and readers of Nowhere Chronicles. In the end, Blackwell beat them on the track, and they stopped showing up, seemingly falling off the face of the earth and fading to black with a whimper. Thus inlaid the theme of this particular Groovy Hollow race. The race was to be a throwback of sorts, with many drivers choosing to throw back to late-model greats who never quite made it to one of the 3 national NASCAR touring series, or chose not to pursue it for whatever reason. Brandon Power decided that he was going to throw back to Richie Evans, the king of the modified series. The scheme fits in perfectly for the Halloween season. It was a bright orange car with a black roof and black numbers on the sides. David Smith decided that he was going to throw back his number 25 car to his all-time favorite driver, Jimmie Johnson. Specifically, the scheme with which he won his 7th and final NASCAR Cup Series title. What remained a mystery was whether or not the Halloween machine would return yet again to defend Bucky Blackwell's unmatched reign of terror. Dad bought tickets and printed them off, storing them in a safe place until it was time to go to the track. The family had adopted a new puppy named Willis, who enjoyed chewing up paper and household valuables, including Tommie's throwback Mountain Dew hat produced when Dale Earnhardt Jr. threw it on back to Darrell Waltrip's iconic number 11 car from the 80s at Darlington. When the day of the race came, like the year before, Dad picked Tommie up early from school. They went through the same old song and dance with the secretary before leaving the school building and hopping up in Dad's truck. "I don't want to spend a whole lot of money on concessions there this year," Dad said as he started the truck and it rumbled to life. "So I figured that we'd just pack our lunch, picnic style, you know?" "Sure, good idea. What'd you pack?" Tommie asked, fastening her seatbelt. "Bologna and sandwich bread. The honey oat kind. I know that's your favorite." "Cool, did you get some?" "Yes, dear, I remembered the mustard," Dad said teasingly as he shifted his truck into drive and peeled away from the school. They went home first, ate some lunch, and packed up the essentials. Tommie remembered the sunscreen, replaced a couple of her dad's Mountain Dews with some water, and was ready to go. Dad did a couple of final sweeps of the house, never wanting to leave anything necessary behind. Since Mom was at work, she guessed it was good of him to be overly cautious rather than mindless. It was going on 1 o'clock when they finally left the house and headed for the raceway. The on-track schedule was more or less the same as the year before. They had a couple of practice sessions so the drivers could get their cars under them before turning laps in time trials to determine their starting positions. There were more people already there in the parking lot this time around than in the previous year. as the gravel lot was already over a quarter full. "We'll have to walk a little more this go-around," Dad said. Tommie didn't mind walking. In fact, she'd have to get it in her mind to pull back on the reins a little bit so as not to leave her father in the dust. They got out of the truck, and she threw the backpack cooler over her shoulders and slammed the door. "Hey, miss," a man said, walking up to her. She jerked around, somewhat startled, to find an older man wearing a warm smile. This put her at ease some, but not all the way. Her mom and dad had long advocated for her to be inherently mistrustful of strangers, especially as they approach a parking lot. He was carrying a weathered Dr. Enough box with him, balancing it and all its contents on his outstretched forearm. He reached inside it and pulled out a pin that was a cross wrapped in a red, white, and blue ribbon. "For you," he said, and a card was attached to it. The card read, "First Baptist Church of Whisperwood. Come worship with us." Tommie put it into the pocket of her jean shorts and thanked the man. He didn't say a word, only nodded his appreciation and then was off. "What do you want?" Dad asked, and she turned startled again. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, fine, Daddy. He just gave me this pen." She pulled the pen out from her pocket and showed it to him. Dad took it, considering it a moment before handing it back to her. He nodded. "All right, then." He looked around suspiciously for the old man, but he was nowhere to be seen. It was as if he had disappeared like a ghost into a foggy night, leaving behind no traces but a patriotic pin. Thinking of ghosts, Tommie's thoughts unwillingly turned to Bucky Blackwell. Would he make an appearance tonight to defend his title? Only time would tell, Tommie supposed, but the prospect of such a thing heightened her anxiety, and in the hot sun she found it hard to breathe. "Come on, let's go," Dad said, and the two of them started heading towards Gate 1. As they approached the gate, Dad pulled the tickets out from his back pants pocket and handed one of them to Tommie. She grabbed it and unfolded it. Pictured on it was the likeness of the Halloween machine doing donuts on the start-finish line. The picture must have been snapped right before the lightning struck. She handed her ticket to the man in the red vest at the gate. His hair was longer than the year before, but his name tag still read Cody. He took the ticket from her, scanned it into the system, and handed it back along with the lime green paper bracelet. "In case you leave and want to come back, we can't scan tickets twice," he explained. They went through the cooler on her backpack and walked through a metal detector. "They sure have more bells and whistles than last year," Dad observed, just as he finished getting patted down. "Come on, let's find our seats," Tommie said, and they headed for the grandstands. Chapter 13. Tommie and her dad paid specific attention to the first practice session. They had gone to the info booth down beneath the bleachers, but the final programs for the event weren't ready yet. Odd, considering that the facility itself seemed to have taken a violent shove into the modern era. Gone were the porta-johns and rickety infrastructure. They had working toilets now with their own septic system. The concession stand, too, had a sizable upgrade as they no longer were housed in tents that could blow away at the suggestion of a heavy wind. Now they were encased in concrete huts with black overhead awnings. Groovy Hollow Raceway logos were emblazoned in the corners. They were also able to take cards beyond the cash-only debacle that was last year. Luckily, Dad had cash on him. He always did, just in case. But the people were handing over credit and/or debit cards, and along with it came the various electronic chirping noises. It was a welcome symphony, for sure. Tommie and Dad must have scanned the pit road a dozen times or so, looking for any car that might strike some chord of memory. The usual prospects were there. Back was David Smith and his number 25 Chevy, this year sponsored by The Roar Viewer's Guide, in association with Groovy Media. Brandon Power was back, driving a number 6 Heartburn Begone Chevy with associate sponsorship by Big Box. Newcomers were added to the mix as well as various local green racers and kings of the East Tennessee, Western North Carolina scene. At the very end of pit road, though, there was a car that was still covered. Its car cover bellowed in the wind at each passing car as they came out of turn 4, headed for the start-finish line. The cover was plain black, but the way it ominously sat there, plain possum, made Tommie's stomach churn. She looked at her dad. If he had noticed it, he showed no sign of it. He might have just skipped over it, paying the resting car no mind at all. Through his binoculars, he was too busy looking for the Halloween machine, but it was nowhere in sight. Tommie wondered grimly if maybe that meant it was too early for Bucky Blackwell to make his dreaded appearance. After all, he didn't fester into being until just before driver intros the year before. Practice carried on as if nothing was out of place. Dad opened the cooler, saw that he had only 2 of his glass bottle Mountain Dews in there, and shot Tommie a side eye. He knew what she had done. He cracked open the bottle to the welcome hiss of carbonation and took a long gulp. It was an unusually hot day, even for Commonwealth, for it to be the end of October. The sun was bright and hot, and there was a little cloud cover littering the bright blue sky. The aluminum bleachers were working their tanning bed magic, and Tommie could feel it. She reached into the side pocket of the cooler and handed her dad over the tube of SPF 70. "Put this on," she said, but he declined, declaring that burning up was a small price to pay for a lucrative tan. "Suit yourself," Tommie said, but the truth was that it bothered her. She knew about the harmful rays of the sun, recalling being taught the lesson back in grade school by Blue Lizard Sunscreen. Blue Lizard was a new sponsor over at Bristol Motor Speedway that year, and a representative came to her Charles Park Elementary School to spread the good word about the dangers of too much sun exposure. What made the lesson stick, specifically to Tommie, was that for promotional purposes, the company was running a contest between each 4th grade class at the school. The objective of the contest was to design a school bus that transported racegoers from the, at the time, free public parking over to BMS proper. The winning class would all get to go see the race live and in person, taking along a family member of their choice. For Tommie, the choice was easy. It was a good opportunity for her and her dad to watch a race for free. They had been going religiously by that point, but who could still turn down a free race? Needless to say, Tommie's class won, and they all got to go to the 2004 Food City 500. It was one of the first times she got to share that part of herself with her classmates, and it was beyond cool. She shoved the sunscreen back into the side pocket of the backpack and crossed her arms, turning her attention back to the practice session. Her eyes drew back to that lonely covered car resting at the end of the pits. There was no driver and no crewman in sight. As the second practice session drew to a close, Tommie decided that she was hungry, and she was going to make herself a bologna sandwich. She unzipped the cooler backpack and pulled out the loaf of honey oat bread, the bottle of mustard, and the prepackaged all-American beef bologna. She made her sandwich, putting what she deemed just the right amount of mustard on it. The gooey yellow condiment was beading and dripping off the sides of the bread, and then handed the ingredients to her dad. She made a sandwich for himself, skipping on the mustard, in Tommie's opinion, and the two enjoyed their little picnic in the stands. It was an ideal day, or it seemed to be. Tommie was happy. Dad seemed to be happy too, if not somewhat fried by the sun. He was turning so red that he almost looked like a lobster. Luckily, qualifying was coming up soon, and the sun had just started to dip below the horizon of the black surrounding hills. The cars started to line up for qualifying, and Tommie noticed something depressing. Less than half of the cars that showed up to attempt the field this year compared to last year. By all accounts, despite the race being practically dominated by Bucky Blackwell and the Halloween machine, the first Groovy Hollow 300 was thought to be a massive success. Yet there were fewer competitors willing to participate in the sequel. Tommie wondered why that was. It could have something to do with sequels never living up to the hype and sensationalism of the original. Her mind turned to countless horror franchises that had spawned at least one sequel and how they'd failed the original film. There were cases, of course, where the second movie ended up outperforming and being better than the original, but that was hardly ever the case. Tommie didn't want to even consider the idea that the sequel Groovy Hollow 300 event might be a bust before it even began, and she shunned the thought, pushing it far away from her. The first driver out to qualify was Ernest Long, and Tommie recognized his throwback scheme right off the bat. The sides of the car were predominantly black and yellow, with a white 13 door number branded on the side. But what got Tommie's attention the most was the branding on the hood of the car. It was colored a hot neon pink, and the writing read, "The Junkyard Jacks." Tommie remembered the name of the historically infamous racing gang that supposedly ruled the scene prior to Bucky Blackwell and the Halloween machine taking the reins. There were two other matching cars in the field, the the similarly designed black and yellow number 66 with a neon yellow hood and the number 24 with a blue hue to the hood. Tommie stood up and said to her dad, "I'll be right back," and started to turn. Dad called after her, "But wait, it's starting." She turned back to face her dad. "Yeah, I know. I'm just going to see if they've got the programs in yet. That's all," she said. She had a sinking feeling that something wasn't right with the Junkyard Jacks, and she didn't think beyond the realm of possibility that Bucky Blackwell could make his return. She ran down the bleacher steps and under them, darting directly for the information tent near the front gate. The same woman was there before, the fiery redhead with the soothing southern voice that kind of reminded Tommie of Reba McEntire. "Excuse me, miss," Tommie said, approaching the woman. The woman paused from what she was doing and looked up. She smiled, and that grin was almost as bright as her blazing hair. "Oh, yeah, I know what you want. Lucky for you, I just got a few delivered. Hot off the press, they say." She laughed then, and it was a warm and genuine sound that was pleasant to the ears. The woman turned, fishing through some things in a cardboard box behind her before pulling out an official Groovy Hollow 2 program sealed in a plastic Ziploc bag. At the bottom was a small die-cast car, rather than sporting the number 22 for the year, and Groovy Hollow 2 providing the sponsorship. The tiny 1:64 scale die-cast was a copy of the number 31 Halloween machine from the year prior. The sensationalizing of Bucky Blackwell's legacy in his victory last year had been confirmed. Tommie almost walked away then, refusing to buy such a product based on the die-cast alone. The woman's face darkened then into an expression of concern. "Oh, what's the matter, honey? Why, you look like you just seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Tommie thought aloud. But when she looked up to see the woman's frown bolden, she shook off her concerns. She put a smile on her face despite all the tension and discomfort she felt. "I'll take it." She reached into her jean shorts pocket and pulled out a crumpled-up $20 bill. "Will this cover it?" she asked. The woman took the highly creased bill and observed it. "Well, really, the programs are $22. You don't have an extra couple of bucks on you?" Tommie started patting her pockets. "Nothing." The woman held up a hand, laughing. By the sound out on the track, Ernest had finished his qualifying lap, giving way to the next Junkyard Jack, apparently named Randall Wheeler. "I'm just playing with you, girl. Grow a sense of humor. Here you go." The fiery woman pushed the program toward Tommie. Tommie took the program and held it close to her. She was somewhat surprised that the touch of the die-cast didn't burn through her shirt. It felt cursed, that was for sure. "Don't mention it. Enjoy the race, Tommie." Tommie started to walk away, but turned back when the woman spoke her name. She opened her mouth to ask her how she knew what her name was, but the woman turned, returning her attention to what she was doing before Tommie so rudely interrupted her. Maybe she had told the woman her name when she walked in. Maybe Dad came down and talked to her at some point. Either way, she decided that maybe it didn't matter. She went back up to her seat and sat down beside her dad just as Randall Wheeler was crossing the line in his number 24 Chevy. Their times were nearly identical. "Oh, hey, they got some in," her dad said, sitting down his half-finished Mountain Dew and taking the program from her. "Wow, that's a pretty cool die-cast," Dad exclaimed. "Another collection for the shelf over your bed, huh, Tommie? It'd fit right in with all those horror movie figurines you have." It would fit in perfectly to the decor of her room. However, unlike most of the horror movies she'd seen, this one hit a little too close to home. But she didn't say anything about that, knowing that most likely Dad wouldn't want to know where she was coming from anyway. "Yeah," she said. "Can I see the booklet?" Dad pulled the book out from the plastic bag, focusing mostly on the die-cast. "Wow, would you look at the detail." Tommie, on the other hand, thumbed through the program. She went to the number 13. The name listed was Ernest Long. There was no picture of the man, just a blackened silhouette of a man with an average body type. She glanced over at the infield garage area, hoping to see either Ernest Long or Randall Wheeler standing by their cars. But nobody was there. Their cars were parked and left alone with their window nets down. No crewmen to be seen around them. She glanced down at the end of pit road. Some sluggish crew members in all black stood around the last car in line. They moved like zombies, and as they uncovered the 00 car, Tommie was met with a whirlwind of horrific flashbacks. "He's back," she said softly, not knowing for sure if Dad would hear her, but he did. Who, Blackwell? He placed the die-cast carefully down beside his Mountain Dew and grabbed for his binoculars. No, Tommie said. She pointed. End of pit road, it's Jerry Slater. It was possible that Jerry looked better than he had the year before, but the difference was small. He didn't look so much like a corpse, but he didn't look entirely healthy either. Considering his past and the crowd he used to run in, Tommie figured that maybe he hadn't been healthy in a very long time. Still, he looked sickly. And though he didn't appear to be dead yet, Tommie got the burning feeling in the pit of her stomach that he would be soon. Well, would you look at that? Dad said, but his voice was strange. It was small and diminished, as if he didn't know what the appropriate thing to say was. He knew Jerry. He knew him better than most people. He knew what he was into and the questionable decisions he'd made throughout his whole life. Tommie got the sense that he almost pitied the man. He looks better, don't you think? Dad asked, but the question was rhetorical. Despite the rhetorical nature of Dad's question, Tommie said, Yeah, I guess so, lying through her clenched teeth. Yeah, well, hopefully he'll get a race this year, huh? Dad said and did his best to put on a hopeful yet weary smile. The qualifying session carried on. The Junkyard Jacks, all three of them, topped the scoring pylon with Ernest nabbing the pole. David Smith qualified in fourth, with Brandon Power rounding out the top 5 starters. Surprisingly, and in a steep contrast to last year, in which he barely made it into the big show by the skin of his teeth, Jerry Slater qualified mid-pack in the 22nd position. 39 cars participated in time trials, and the announcer started rounding off the starting order. The announcer this time was somebody whose voice Tommie didn't recognize. It wasn't Jeremy or Davis. It wasn't any of the other YouTubers who made racing content. It was a new voice, and there was a radio-like quality to it, as if the man had been trained to be a DJ over at the Hawk. He was smooth and high-pitched, sharp even. He paused when announcing Slater in the lineup. He said, And we here at Groovy Hollow want to send a warm welcome back to Jerry Slater. Slater attempted to qualify for this race a year ago, but he was struck with an unexpected illness. He's back now, and not only did he qualify for the race, he did so in a convincing fashion. So way to go, Jerry. We're thrilled he's back. There was a hesitant clatter of applause from fans who were just starting to filter in. He continued running down the list of starters when he said, And that brings us to our 40th and final entry in tonight's race. Tommie and Dad looked at one another. Dad said, Only 39 cars qualified? I know, Tommie whispered and started gnawing in her bottom lip. Starting 40th tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is the defending winner of this race. Oh no, Tommie moaned. He's the man, the myth, the legend appearing here again for all of you via a special invite. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the driver of the number 31 Halloween Machine Chevrolet, the legendary, infamous Bucky Blackwell. Cautious applause littered throughout the grandstands. On the backstretch, some officials opened up the gate in the wall and the sound of an engine fired up and was approaching slowly. Deja vu, Tommie thought and watched. Just as she had the year before, the Halloween machine crept into her vision and rolled out onto the track. With its black-tinted windows, Bucky gassed up his Halloween machine and drove it down into the corner, headed for pit road. Tommie's eyes went straight for Jerry Slater, who stood beside his car, cleaning the dirt out from his fingernails, and appearing entirely disinterested. She remembered his collapse, how the EMTs loaded him up in the ambulance and carried him away. She recalled how the zombified team heartbreakingly covered the car back up and was pushing it around the corner when Blackwell paused, seemingly having a word with him. Was all of this planned? Tommie shuddered to think so, but there were entirely too many coincidences for it not to draw at least some suspicion. And what was this back via special invite business about? Dad seemed to collapse in his chair. He looked at Tommie. Well, I guess we know who's going to win this year again. His disappointment was boldly marked. Tommie looked to the front of the field at the 3 Junkyard Jacks cars. The drivers and crews were standing around, laughing and carrying on, seemingly having a good time. They weren't worried, whatever the case. They're old rivals, Tommie thought. She said, I don't know, Dad. There might be more to it than that. Those junkyard boys might just give him a run for his money. One could hope, Dad said, ironically with that hope visibly draining out of him. Collectively, the crowd stood and went through the motions of the opening ceremonies. Bucky Blackwell didn't so much as get out of his car, which caught the attention of a number of fans who grumbled their disapproval. "Disrespectful," one of them said in a huff. "Disgraceful," said another. Nonetheless, the ceremonies carried on without so much as a pause. It wasn't long before all that noise died out, and all that was left was the purring of the engines as they were given the command. The one giving the command this year was yet again Eric Estep from Out of the Groove. He hyped up the crowd the best he could, occasionally looking back to the car and bringing up the rear of the pack. Did he know about the Bucky Blackwell invitation? Surely not, but you never know. Soon, all that was left to do was pull the belts tight and go racing. The car slowly rolled off pit road, feeding out onto the track. They turned their pace laps. The flagman readied his flag, and then it was all green, green, green. The track roared to life. It would be hard to imagine not nearly every eye being fixated on that black, orange, and white number 31 Halloween machine as he started, in a hurry slicing and dicing his way through the back of the track. Fading to somewhat of an afterthought was Jerry Slater, who also started moving forward but slowly, taking his time and perhaps saving his equipment. It wasn't long, though, before that 00 Chevy had cracked the top 5, and Bucky was hot on his heels. It piqued Tommie's interest to see how the two might race one another. After all, Bucky Blackwell effectively replaced Slater in the race the year before following his strange and sudden medical episode. But out front, the Junkyard Jacks were holding the rest of the field at bay. Fourth place, Brandon Power saw those matching neon-painted cars stretch their lead farther and farther away. Slater patiently worked on Power to pass him, as Bucky Blackwell slipped into 6th and then 5th right behind him. That was when the first caution of the night flew. The spinner spun in the back right of the front of the leaders. Upon replay, Tommie could see the contact that started it. Ernest Long was leading the race and approaching the end of the field to start lapping cars. He drove his number 13 car deep into the third corner. And there just so happened to be a driver there. A slower driver. The number on the door was 47. Tommie quickly flipped to the program to find the driver involved. Carol Oates was the driver's name. She was 82 years of age, racing in what would possibly be her final race. Under the abbreviated driver bio section of the page, a quote by her was written out. It read, "My daddy was the best race car driver I'd ever seen. He spent his whole life racing. I'm racing this last race for him." Tommie looked back up the track with tears stinging her eyes. Carol Oates' car was resting with its rear smashed up against the outside wall. The Junkyard Jacks raced on as if nothing happened and it was no big deal. To be fair, though, so did the rest of the pack. Most of them didn't know Carol Oates from Eve, so she was just some woman, a fellow driver. But looking at her picture in the program, and how she looked like somebody's sweet grandma from the deep wrinkles, good-natured and helpful smile, and curly white hair, Tommie's heart sank. The spectators pointed at the wreck as it unfolded, and Tommie was thankful that she had missed seeing the initial impact at that moment. Some fans clapped and cheered because, rather than enjoying a good quality racing product, all they were there for in reality was to watch the wrecks. They had no idea who was inside that car when it crashed into the hard concrete wall, nor did they care. If anything, they wanted safety crews to hurry up and finish the cleanup so they could watch more of the carnage. The safety crews took their time dealing with the driver of the number 47, which only made Tommie's heart sink lower. A red flag was displaced over the flag stand, and slowly, as the seriousness of the situation started to sink through, the crowd fell silent. In the end, they had to cut Miss Carol Oates out of the car. They placed her on a stretcher. She did not appear to be responsive. Then they loaded her up in the back of an ambulance, started the siren, and ushered her away towards the hospital. Safety crews cleaned up the debris and cleared the track of the car. While all of that was going on, Tommie's eyes became fixated on the new viewing screen hovering over the scoring pylon. She watched as the operators showed the brutal impact again and again at different angles. By the looks of it to Tommie, it looked like a careless driver. Ernest Long didn't even pretend to slow down. He didn't even try. Rather, he threw his number 13 Chevy into that corner with every intention not to rattle her cage, but to drive right through her fate be damned. Now she was in the back of an ambulance riding to the hospital, and he was sitting on the backstretch leading the race and letting his engines and tires cool. Though the officials and safety personnel weren't stocked as high as those at a real NASCAR race, it was still a better situation than the first year. As a whole, the cleanup took a total of about 20 minutes, and soon the cars were refired and turning laps under yellow. Tommie didn't know why race officials did this. Maybe it was out of fear of something else bad happening. Maybe it was for some other reason, but they kept the cars pacing under caution for an extended amount of time, almost to the point of absurdity. But after another 15 minutes or so of wasting time under yellow flag cautions, the race restarted. Fans settled back down, allowing Carol Oates in her condition to drift away from their minds as they waited for the next piece of insanity the night had in store. Bunched back up now, Bucky Blackwell made his move. He passed Jerry Slater for fourth and was chomping at the heels of the Junkyard Jacks. Now, with no slower traffic in his way, the Jacks couldn't get away from the Halloween machine. Jerry Slater stayed pretty close, too, not wanting to be kicked out of contention. The first of the Jacks Bucky passed was Randall Wheeler in the 24. He didn't make it easy by any means, either, as the two drivers leaned heavily on one another. After a couple of laps of hard battle, Bucky finally got around Wheeler, sending him back into Slater's clutches. Slater wasn't to be counted out either. He roughed up the back of the bumper of Wheeler's car, knocking him out of the track and out of the racing groove into the marbles. Blackwell went through to third, and Slater slipped into fourth. The Halloween machine then set its sights on Mike Davis, the third member of the Junkyard Jacks ensemble and driver of the number 66. Davis wasn't about to pull aside, and after 10 or so laps of hard racing, Bucky finally booted him up the track. He lost control of his car and smashed hard onto the outside concrete barrier. The car was totaled. Still, they raced back to the line, but no one was standing in the way between Bucky Blackwell and his Halloween machine and the original of the Junkyard Jacks, Ernest Long. Unlike Carol Oates, Mike Davis was able to climb out from the wreckage of his number 66 machine. He stood beside his mangled car, waiting for the field to pass by. He was a big man, almost too large for Tommie to imagine him being able to fit inside a late model stock. His head was large, his face was round, his shoulders broad, and by the expression on his face, Tommie knew that he wasn't too happy. As the field crawled by, he walked down the track and gave Blackwell a couple of one-fingered salutes, much to the chagrin of the crowd. Controversy created cash, and there ain't nothing like tempers boiling over during a Friday night short-track bout. Davis was eventually ushered into the back of an ambulance and hauled to the infield care center. Cleanup continued as safety crews and officials loaded up the destroyed number 66 car of Davis and took it back to the garage. By the time the race was ready to restart, they were inside 10 laps to go. The race would restart with 8 laps remaining, and Blackwell proved why he was the undisputed master of Groovy Hollow Raceway. It could have been argued that Bucky's Halloween machine jumped the start. It was a close call, and one racing official didn't feel the need to make it. They deemed the restart good, and Blackwell, who chose to restart on the inside lane right behind the leader, was already moving down the track into turn 1, ready to dive bomb Long. This created a 3-wide battle for the lead. Bucky was as low on the racing surface as he could go. Ernest Long was pinched in the middle, and Jerry Slater was running on ice in the outside lane's marbles. Somehow, they managed not to crash coming out of turn 2. Slater faded and dropped back, settling into third with 6 laps remaining. Blackwell and Long battled on side by side. The final caution of the night occurred when the other remaining Junkyard Jack, Randall Wheeler, sent his number 24 Chevy into the corner a little too aggressively in an attempt to gain the upper hand on Slater. Unfortunately, the car didn't stick and shot up the track. Wheeler made contact with Slater, and he attempted to correct himself before driving headfirst into the outside wall. Tommie recalled a time when that wall wasn't even part of the facility, and all that was on the other side was a sand dune running down towards the creek. She would think later that not having a wall there would have prevented what happened to Slater. Would he have been able to roll his car up in the sand and climb out upset, granted, but relatively unscathed? She didn't know, and she supposed that there was no point in speculating. What happened still happened in the end, and pointing the finger at any particular oversight was a farce. The flagman immediately threw the caution flag with 3 laps to go, and the pack was riding down the backstretch, trying their best to slow up before reaching the wreck in the crux of turns 3 and 4. Slater's 00 car came to rest with the driver's side pressed up against the wall. Safety crews rushed over, and the bad feeling Tommie had when Carol Oates crashed returned with a vengeance. However, unlike Carol Oates, who was beaten up clearly but otherwise still somewhat responsive, there was nothing when it came to Slater. No movement, no thumbs up to signal to both the spectators and the crowd that everything was going to be all right. Rather, there was a sense of urgency. The pack ran 2 more laps under caution before the officials would throw the second red flag of the night. They called the cars down pit road and told the drivers to shut him off until further notice. They had to cut Slater out of the car, which took a long time. Tommie watched on nervously, gripping the trembling hand of her father. It was never fun as a fan of the sport to sit through moments like that, to be scared out of wits' end. But it was different for her dad, Tommie knew. He went to high school with Slater back in the day. They never were really friends, or at least Dad never gave any indication that they were. But they knew of one another. They passed each other in the hollowed halls of the Commonwealth High School. Maybe they shared a sup or two, but maybe they didn't. But that wasn't really the point. Dad knew the man and bought his daughter a late model from him when it appeared that maybe his dreams of being a racer had given up on him. With last year's medical scare, it was a wonder he ever got to compete again. Now here he was, and he wasn't just turning laps in the back of the pack. He was actually contending. Maybe he didn't have the race-winning speed to compete with the Junkyard Jacks, but he did have a little bit of something under his hood. The track fell silent as the ambulance disappeared out of the backstretch gate, taking yet another racer to the hospital. As the sirens faded to nothing, officials met on pit road. It was decided that they would restart the race, green-white checkered style, by having a 2-lap shootout to the finish. The next flag to fly, whether it be a yellow or anything else, would officially put an end to the second edition of the Groovy Hollow 300. After refiring their engines, the field ran 2 slow laps under caution before the flagman threw the green flag in the air. Heading into the first corner of the shootout, Blackwell had the advantage, but Ernest Long hung strong on the outside, taking the lead by inches as they headed down the backstretch. It was much of the same as the leaders rolled through turns 3 and 4 and took the white flag side by side. Into turns 1 and 2 for the final time, Long was a little more aggressive. He cut to the left and slammed hard into the side of Blackwell's Halloween machine. But if anything, the move did more damage to his own car than it did to the fabled number 31, which carried on confidently with defiance in its motor oil like an indestructible tank. Long, meanwhile, momentarily lost pace. He swerved, trying to collect himself, and once he got his car back under him, rushed for the third turn with no intention of making the corner. It was a swing and a miss. The front bumper of the number 13 Junkyard Jack throwback didn't connect with the rear bumper of Blackwell's Halloween machine. Rather, Ernest Long lost control, drifted up the track, and slammed into the outside wall. Bucky Blackwell crossed the finish line first to win yet another of the cursed events, virtually unchallenged. Tommie looked to the heavens, waiting for that bolt of lightning to streak across the black sky yet again. But lightning rarely strikes twice, if ever. Instead, the stadium lights winked out. The sound of them shutting off sounded like a car collision in and of itself. It was a thunderous whack that resonated and echoed through the valley. The sound of static came over the loudspeakers, along with the sound of some kind of struggle. The outage lasted, in reality, only about a minute. But standing there in the darkness, with her sea of confused fellow spectators, it felt like an eternity. Eventually, the lights did power back on. But unlike when they shut off all at once, powering them back on was a slow burn. The static in the loudspeaker faded, and all that could be heard, other than the commotion of the frightened crowd, was the buzz of the stadium lights. They started dim, but grew in brightness with each passing second. By the time the stadium was half lit to the capacity it was before, Tommie noticed that the Halloween machine had vanished yet again into the night. Along with Blackwell went the 3 Junkyard Jack cars into the night, All that remained down on pit road were drivers scratching their heads in confusion. It appeared that not even they knew who won. But Tommie knew. It was Bucky Blackwell and his Halloween machine. She knew this too. Something was terribly wrong in Commonwealth, and it had something to do with Bucky in that car. And maybe even the junkyard jacks. She knew not what his plan was, or if there even was one. All she knew was that she was determined to stop them.
That concludes this episode of The Legend of Groovy Hollow, but there's still more to come. Coming up in the next episode of The Legend of Groovy Hollow, Tommie spends some more time with Carol Oates, and we'll learn more about the hidden history of the Halloween machine and the rivalry between Bucky Blackwell and Jerry Slater. The Legend of Groovy Hollow is a novel written by Cody Williams and performed by Jillian Cool. Groovy Hollow is a production of Out of the Groove, The Daily Downforce, and AE Engine. For more great content like this, visit dailydownforce.com.